today I have a very strange topic, and what I'm going to do is do things kind of in reverse order that a lot of times I do in topics, which is to begin with things that I'm thinking about, and then go through things that I'm doing. Usually you do things that you're doing, and then you finish up with, and here's what I'm thinking about. I thought I'd do things in a little bit in reverse order today. But before I get there, I thought I'd talk about how we actually got here, and I mean literally why we're here, why the theme. This was discussions that we had a year, and actually Miguel and I have had discussions for this for several years of having some sort of gathering together of people talking about biomusic, music from physiology, basically how the body and music can work together, etc. And so we talked about it for a while. The idea was to get people together to ask some questions about this field, which is, why isn't everybody doing it? Why isn't it just the next best thing since sliced bread? Why are some people doing it? What does it mean? What are the edges of it? Does it mean that you have to be measuring physiology? Does it mean that you're going to be wearing sensors on the body? What does it mean, actually? Does it mean you can hold a mobile phone? Is that the same area? All of these things are questions as to the edge of the field. So that's why we basically, and so I hope that Francisca, in her announcement of the plenary session, really, for me, it's a lot about the discussion we have at the end of this talk and about the plenary session, about having these kinds of discussions. And maybe, just maybe, continuing on to the future. So, a nature hunt for birds of a feather. Got some interesting pictures here. One of the things also that Miguel and I always talk about is the fact that every single time that certainly I give a talk, there's some person that raises their hand and mentions somebody else that they know from 1927 that was doing physiology and music. And so one of the things is I always open it up to the audience. If you know references of people that have done something in this field, please speak up, because we're sort of collecting this massive set of references. Here are some of the Dick Reimarker was an interesting reference that I had never ever heard of before. Very few people actually, when they look at this field, talk about it, but it was a piece done in the 1970s where you had a bicyclist naked. And he was on a bike, and he had some sensors on him, and by the way, this was thanks to Itau for introducing me to this whole thing that I had never heard of. So you have this bicyclist, and over the course of 30 minutes, the bicyclist does this. And that's the 30 minutes. And it's the most amazing tour de force of physical strength I've ever seen in my entire life. By the end of the piece, the guy is dripping with sweat. But what you hear is the sonification of muscle, of breathing, of his skin sway. You hear all of these things sonified, some literally sonified, in other words, just straight breathing out to the speakers. Others actually pass through and sonified, applied sound to it. And it's incredible to listen to, because you really begin to feel what this person is going through. We've got I discovered this yesterday, the electrophone, which, by the way, was also from the 5 States of Matter Man, but which is a reference to basically I won't even go into it. But it ends up that there's this device from the mid-1940s that was looking at taking EEG and converting it to music as well. And of course, I have to throw out the Alvin Messier reference, because you get fired if you didn't. And then, of course, where we are today with devices like NeuroSky and Emotive looking at things, but they don't really talk much about music. They just say, oh, here are some really cool ways of measuring physiology, but it's just a matter of time, and I'm sure there probably are people converting this into music. So I want to know where we are and where we're going, and are we even at the beginning yet? So has this field actually started yet? Is it still in its infancy after 20 years and it hasn't even started yet, or where are we going with it? That's kind of why we're here today, is to have that discussion. How did I get here? Matau, you got to look up at the screen. I found that and I thought, oh, that's just fantastic. If I was going to put the upper right, I had to put the center as well. This is how long certainly Tao and I have been looking at this stuff. But for me it was, has been and always will be a search for this creation of an interface where where you're looking at the internal body, where gesture isn't necessary, gesture is welcome, but gesture isn't always necessary, where actually, and what I'm going to be talking about today, where not just muscle tension, but the change in emotion can control sound and music. And that's always been my fascination, is with emotion and empathy. Is there some way where I can measure what's going on inside you right now, know about it, share it, have a group sharing of that experience? Is there a way to really create that into some sort of piece? And that's really the exploration we've been doing. And just for a question for Tao, and I'm sorry to pick on you, but I promise I'll stop.
Sure.
But lower right, do you recognize the photo on the lower right?
No.
Dikuku.
All right. 1990.
Yeah, Dikuku was a band that was 3 girls in a soldering iron, was what they were called in the news. But basically there was 3 vibraphone players. They also did taiko drumming, and they were one of the first people to wear the bio-knee system way back then. So, my interest in emotion. The thing about emotion is that you immediately think of words. You think of happy and sad and angry and all those different words. And in fact, that's what psychologists have for many, many, many years been exploring, are these words, the taxonomy of emotion, how we declare what emotional state we have. I'm not really thrilled with that. I never have been, especially if you're going to design a musical instrument or a musical piece. Music really doesn't lend itself to discrete states like bing, you're happy, bing, you're sad. I mean, it's just, it really doesn't lend itself to music. What music lends itself, and designing a musical instrument lends itself to, is dimensions and movement. And so that's really what I've been concentrating on. But I just wanted to kind of get you, and for some of you this is old hat, but just to get you in the space of things. On the right-hand side is what's commonly used to describe the dimensions of emotion, from happiness to sadness, and from large amount of activation to low amount of activation. So an example would be an emotion with positive valence and low activation would be serenity. But the dimensions that we really care about are activation and valence. And then from those dimensions, these other dimensions, well, these words came up and then the dimensions came along. From Geneva, this is the GEMS set of words, because they actually thought that music, the standard words that we use to describe emotion, may not always apply to music. And so they had words like wonder and transcendence, nostalgia. These are words that you probably wouldn't use when describing standard emotions, but you might describe them as you're listening to music. And that's what I was interested in, and am interested in, is these dimensions and how we can use that to control and create a musical instrument control, and use that to interact between you and I. And been brainstorming with this for many months now with a colleague at Queen's in psychology, because he, by the way, this is contentious. There's probably no psychologists. I don't know if there are any psychologists in the room. Any psychologists in the room? Also, I can say anything I want. That's fantastic. It is contentious talking about taxonomy versus dimension, but luckily I had found a colleague here at Queen's that had a similar desire to look at dimensions rather than actual words. And we began discussing, because again, being an electrical engineer, I'm interested in a lot of the annoying charts and graphs of things, and this exploration of dimensions. And we began talking about this room, and you, and the people in here, and you looking at me, and you looking at this screen, and all of the different emotions that you feel when you look at everybody here. And I certainly do. I mean, I look at current students, former students, current and former colleagues, and each one of you represents something different and a different emotion. And as you feel me look around, you can kind of feel this contour that begins to happen in the room as I feel. If you look at dimensions of emotion, I'm not feeling happy, sad, anger, this. I'm feeling these surfaces as I look through you. But then also, I look at Javier, and I think of memories, and I pull back, and actually, I might not be looking at Javier, even though I'm looking at Javier, and I have dimensions of those emotions that I feel of memories that occurred before now. And so I can explore those spaces as well. So in this room, there's a present contour of emotions, and then there's a depth moving back inside me and outside of me that I can explore as well. And those dimensions and surfaces are the things that controllers are made of music controllers are made of. These moving up and down, these exploring these different spaces. And that's really what intrigues me about emotion, about creating emotion controllers and emotion. And is there some way of doing this? Is there some way of exploring this space? Is there some way that you will recognize that I'm feeling this way? If there is sound or a piece of music that I could play that wouldn't invoke the emotion in me, but would evoke the emotion in you, and you would go, yes, I know exactly where in that space he is emotionally. And that's the other intriguing thing of putting all of these things together. So that's dimensions and surfaces, and that's really what's begun. Remember that I said at the beginning that I want to begin by things I'm thinking about. These are the things I'm thinking about, and now I'll talk about my research. So my research, as in my life, has really spanned three areas: art, engineering, and science. I've been very, very fortunate to explore all three of those areas. The art at which we're looking at is how I can take those surfaces and make those into music, into a musical controller in some interesting and hopefully engaging way. And definitely talk about that more. The engineering, how to create a system that does that, and then the science, what is that system based on? How do we actually build a system? Are these surfaces measurable? Do they exist? Are they repeatable? All of those questions have to be answered to create that. And that's the beauty of this field, is that all of these three things are interrelated. And when we work together, colleagues in this room, when we work together on these pieces, it's really moving back and forth between those three things constantly. So the art, as I said, is there a way to create an interface using measurements of emotion? And in the modern world, the word neuroscience didn't exist. It's an obvious word, but it didn't exist a few years ago. It's become the buzzword of the 2010s. If you do anything that involves your brain in science now, you're a neuroscientist. And digital luthier, I love that word. That was coined somewhere in the evolution of NIME. I don't know where that ever came from, but I love that word. One of the characteristics of this interaction, if I create an interface that's related to my emotion, to what I'm feeling, or to what you're feeling as an audience, what are the characteristics? Is it repeatable? Is it one time? Is it unique? Is it intuitive, etc.? And of course, the main question is this interesting? So, several years ago, I thought of this idea as I moved between looking at gesture and the invisible interface of muscle tension to looking at emotion. I thought, you know what, I really am interested in in using all of those things in a performance. And because integral medicine had been coming up at the same time, I thought, well, I'll just steal that word. And so I liked the idea of integral music control, that thing that combines, that there is no right answer, that you can have a physical gesture as a fantastic interface, you can have muscle tension as this invisible, wonderful interface, and maybe I can even use emotion, and maybe I can use those all simultaneously. And no. Well, you've left it up, right?
Sorry.
You left it up, yeah. Yeah.
No, it's just because it was starting to make noises. So just
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Sound starting to make noises. Okay. Never have to do
No,
it.
it's starting to make sound.
So this is a drawing that I did several years ago to kind of show that integration of things. The idea that normally you have an emotion and thought, that indeed creates a physical gesture if you're a pianist, that you play the sound, you perceive that sound both orally, as of course you have proprioception when you hit the keyboard, that creates an emotion and thought like, crap, I just hit the wrong note, and then you have a physical gesture, etc. And the idea here was, yeah, that works, but what if we were to actually bypass that physical gesture as well? And then what about you guys, getting you involved in this whole thing? So then the idea was, well, normally you just sit there and you make some gestures and maybe occasionally you smile and maybe you think about, other stuff you have to do that day. And I look at you and I perceive your changes in emotion based on looking at your face. And if I'm a performer, depending on the type of performer, you'll look out at the audience and see what's going on. You might hear them engaging, clapping, whatever. But what if we just take those emotions that you're feeling right now and put those straight into sound generation as well? So the process of getting from looking at you and trying to infer your emotional state to actually using that in performance and using that as a design of an instrument is to begin to look at your physiology. Are there physiological indicators of emotion? And yes, there is a large body of evidence, and certainly the work that we've done and many people have done is that there are things that happen within you that are indicative of your emotion that we can actually quantitatively measure, including respiration, facial EMG, skin sweat, temperature, how your heart rate changes, all of those kind of things. And the good thing is we can measure them and we can begin to recognize patterns in them. The bad thing is that a lot of emotions and measurements of emotions specifically is context dependent. So not only do we have this surface that you have here and all these complex emotions that you're feeling, but you also may have just gone running and sat down and your skin is sweaty. That has nothing to do with an emotional state. Who knows other things you may be thinking about, but just physical changes, your heart may be racing because you just had caffeine. So all of those begin to interfere with this measurement. But the interesting thing when you're working with performers, and this is what we're talking about, performance and audience, is you guys are trapped right now in those seats. You've been sitting there now for 10 or 15 minutes. Your physiology has basically achieved stasis now. You're in a room, the temperature's stable, so the context is now fixed. It's not like a lot of research on emotion where I have to worry about those other conditions. And I'm standing here, my context is fixed as well. If I do start running, well, that's because that's part of the performance. But my context is basically fixed. So it's kind of an interestingly good thing about, because I get a lot of people that will say, well, context-dependent physiology, and I say, well, no, I've got trapped audience and trapped performer, so not so much of a problem. So what I wanted to do is begin by talking about the art. There's no better place to begin with a project that Eric Lyon, right there, and I did starting in 2009. Basically, in terms of practice-led research, it was if we can measure emotion, which is what I've been working on, then can we put it into a piece? And we had this long debate about, not that long actually, it was a pretty short debate, as debates go, of how to demonstrate using your emotion and my emotion to create and modify sound. And so Eric, the debate was about, do we create a brand new piece, trying this out, testing this out? Again, science and art very, very strongly intermingled. A piece as a form of science. Can we do this? And we both decided, Eric had a piece from 2005 that was already done and performed, and so why don't we try to use that and see if we can modify that. That was a laptop piece, so what better way to take a laptop piece and actually then throw away the laptop, which we did figuratively, not literally, and then actually use emotion as a way to control the piece. So I'm going to just describe that a little bit. I believe it's the first piece to be performed using physiological indicators of emotion. I don't know, and again, I sort of throw that out to you guys to go out and prove me wrong. But it was certainly the first one that we ever knew going in, and certainly because of that, had a lot of unknowns as we went forward through it. There was a lot of work to go into the piece. It was the development of the technology, of the way to measure emotion for both audience and performer. There was Eric's work in really recrafting the piece. And then there were a lot of interesting scientific results from that as well. So the tech was basically the performer and all the audience members wear physiological measurement devices. So the audience measured something that measured skin sweat and heart rate, and I, as the performer, wore all of the other respiration, EEG, facial EMG, all of the different measurements of emotion that we could possibly put into the performer were there. That data was then sent to IceWeb to just do real-time signal processing on that data. At the flip side of that, the audience data was being measured going into Max MSP, and all of that converged on Eric's patch to actually control the movement through the piece. So there's basically the IceWeb patch. And by the way, there's always a question when you perform this piece, whether you show things like the physiological indicators of emotion. Is that interesting? Is that not interesting? When you have an invisible interface, and this is a discussion that I always like to bring up, an invisible interface is magical. It's magical for me as a performer to have these changes that occur inside me and have the music change. I think sometimes, certainly in some of the interviews that we did after the performances, I think sometimes it's magical for audience members, but it is completely invisible, and you don't know what's going on. So how much do you reveal of that? Do you wear your wires on the outside of you? Do you display stuff on the screen and show signals? What do you show, or do you show nothing and just have people just listen to the music and experience it? And that's a debate that we've had over and over again. This is interesting. I show this not because just to show off Eric's Max MSP chops, but he has them. But more also to show some of the science that was involved in the piece. Because again, if you think about what I said at the beginning of, I'm not that interested in emotional states. I'm interested in emotional surfaces and change. And what we really discovered is that works very well. And what do I mean by that? I mean that what we used in this piece was emotional change. We didn't assume I was going to be at a given state of emotion and bing, something's going to happen in the musical piece. What we instead decided to do, not from the beginning, but as we went through the piece, is we basically use emotion as a way to move. So as I move along those contours and surfaces, as my emotion changes, we'll use that to push through the piece. And so within the piece, it's interesting because gesture is the thing that controls most of the articulation of sound, and emotion is that thing that moves us forward. There's a couple exceptions, and they're the obvious two exceptions, the beginning and end of the piece. So the beginning of the piece, I'm supposed to be completely and totally relaxed. And no, Javier, I won't tell the story of 2009. I'm supposed to be completely and totally relaxed at the beginning of the piece. That's a fixed state of serenity that I'm supposed to be in. And then at the end of the piece, I have to return to that state. And those are the only two tie points. And everything else is emotional movement through the piece. And so it could be there we go, one pulse wheel. So the beginning of the piece here is basically me going through all of these different emotional states from the serenity and basically taking myself to a state of complete agitation. And this is the end of it, where you can actually just begin to see this incredible anger, agitation, whatever it is, as it moves through the piece. And then relaxation as it ends. And I begin to take myself down out of that section. I just wanted to show you that. Oh, this is an interesting part of the piece. And actually, I might, I'll show you a little piece of this. This is just shown here because simply I wanted to show you how early we were on the exploration of using audience interaction. The idea was that, again, there's a little bug in Prezi that if you don't read it, we didn't know how to use your emotional state. What were we going to do? How do we know what your emotional state was as an audience member? So this is contrived. I walked out into the audience. And the interesting thing about that was that, so what happened there is that each audience member was assigned a voice. And that voice's rate of repetition and pitch were changed as the audience's emotional state changed. The interesting thing too about it is that, believe it or not, I'm inherently shy as well. And so my emotional state was changing simultaneously with the audience's emotional state. And that was to be used in a moment. So first of all, what you heard is you heard me walking towards the audience members and that pitch coming up, and then as I started to walk away, that pitch slowly lowering as they were like, oh shit, he's coming towards me, oh my god, this is really weird, and oh my god, thank god, that's hard. And then you see how quickly emotion changes. I mean, that's how quickly it exists, how quickly it changes, and how quickly it sonifies. But we didn't know that going in before we started all of this. And in fact, the wonderful thing that I always talk about is the very, very first prototype of this piece, we had some students visiting from India. I don't know if you remember that, Pedro. We had some students over here visiting SARC from India for a summer, and we thought, we'll take care of that. We'll get them into the audience, and we'll hook them up with sensors. And I was sitting here, and again, I'm a rather shy performer, and I was sitting there doing the beginning of stem cells, and all this, weird gestural stuff that I do, and then all of a sudden I stood up, and they freaked. I didn't even have to walk out into the audience. They were completely freaked out. Their GSR, their skin resistance went through the way above what we'd calibrated for. Everything was pegged. Nothing musically was interesting at that point because it was all pegged. It was like, oh, okay, that's great. But that's where science meets art. I mean, that's really where we used this piece to completely figure out how all of this stuff was really going to work. I think I have one more clip, and I do, yeah. Flash, don't you? And this is the end of the piece. And the end of the piece is, remember I said there were two tie points. The beginning, which I showed you, and at the end. And the idea at the end of the piece is I have to actually become completely relaxed again. And that's easy, because it's the end of the piece and it's like, thank God, Max didn't crash. My computers are still live. The audience isn't throwing anything at me. And I'm going to be over in a moment. And so the end of the piece is driven by that last gesture of emotion. Which is, by the way, an interesting phrase that we've started using. We talk about emotional gestures, etc., which is implies a cognitive over top of an emotional. A gesture is obviously a cognitive somatic nervous system kind of thing. An emotion is an autonomic nervous system kind of thing. So when we say gesture and emotion, it really is truly an oxymoron, but it's become part of our lexicon anyway. The interesting thing is, these transitional physiological indicators of emotion are reproducible. We didn't know that. We had no idea going in whether any of this stuff would be reproducible. It was. We discovered the emotional cascade, which is when you push forward and you try to visualize serenity. You're at a beach, a Mai Tai is coming, you're relaxed. You end up having this cascade of emotions. And so these sections of the piece that I pushed through are just following on those cascades. And of course, the we had these members of the audience that Javier discovered, which is basically my physiological change and some of the physiological change of some of the audience members actually locked in, and that was creepy. And we discovered that, I think in New York. Wasn't that in New York? This thing was from. Yeah. It was really kind of creepy. And of course, I've showed you some of the most creepy ones right there. And I think that was the audience member that said that they weren't even paying attention that much. So what does that mean? What does it mean that your guy's physiology is locking in with mine? Does that mean that your emotions are locking in with mine? What's going on there that's happening? And can we take advantage of that in another piece? Is there something where the synchrony or synchronicity of the audience members and the performer can be used as an event in itself? Yeah, the other thing we discovered is that good performances happen when I'm most engaged and least distracted. Yeah, that's pretty familiar stuff. So that was basically our piece that we used to begin to explore the art of this. Some of the questions that I keep asking over and over again: is this interesting? Is it interesting for the performer? Yeah, absolutely. I love it. It's one of the most empowering feelings one ever has. And we did early prototypes in 2006-07 of emotion interface, and we did and we even repeated it at Interface, where we had people from the audience. We had what we call Emote to Heaven. We had versions of Stairway to Heaven from monks chanting Stairway to Heaven through Dolly Parton singing Stairway to Heaven, all the way up to Led Zeppelin's doing Stairway to Heaven. And we had audience members come up on stage and hold hands, and of course they're all tense. Oh my God, I'm on stage. This is really weird. I'm holding hands. I hate this person. What's he making me do? And then we basically, so what you heard was Led Zeppelin playing Stairway to Heaven, and then we had everybody go, and all of a sudden you heard Led Zeppelin, Dolly Parton, Tiny Tim, and then finally we had monks chanting Stairway to Heaven, and everybody's like, oh, that's really cool. Back up again. But everybody there was like, wow, this is really cool. I didn't do anything. It's happening from inside me. I didn't fake anything. It's my emotion somehow creating music. There's also a question of how to calibrate, and we're constantly wrestling with that. What is a calibration? How do we grab that? In stem cells, I make a gesture to the audience. And when I make that gesture, it locks in everybody's physiology at that point to look at how the surface goes from there. I've locked in and said, okay, this is where you are in your contour, and now I'm going to lock it, and now any movement you do from then on, I'm going to watch. So the calibration is always an issue. The engineering, so that was the art. The engineering, this is the evolution that I've gone through over the years from a giant box that almost killed the vice president of Yamaha because I had a 10 ohm resistor between him and ground, earth, through prototypes that we did for Sony to actually create really, really cool interactions for Sony that just never got off the ground, to the first wireless device, which we had to wrestle with, to biobands, to different things. The movement mainly for us is how to make something ergonomic for a performer. And is there a way to make this actually a performance interface? And so these are some of the bands that we came up with, that which Tal will kill me for. And then the next step didn't kill me because half the time they don't work. There's various things associated with Tal's labors on that. And next steps, what we're actually working on right now, and over the past couple of weeks have gotten working quite well, is a sensor that fits on your fingertip. It's best for you guys because it actually, instead, what we have to do right now is we have to run trunk lines through the audience, and actually, and when I say we, I mean the graduate students at SARC, run trunk lines around the audience to put on the sensors to measure your skin resistance and to measure your ECG, your heart rate. The new sensors plug into a mobile phone, so now when you go to a performance, you just have to download an app onto your mobile phone. We give you a little sensor that plugs into the audio in of your mobile phone, and then you're good to go. And so we've been working on that to try to make that easier, but also to actually be able to use this in different kinds of mobile environments as well. One of my graduate students is now looking at mobile compositions where these surfaces here exist in this room, but the surfaces are actually spread across the earth. Everybody has emotions, everything elicits emotions. And so these surfaces can actually exist on mobile platforms where my emotion and your emotion 1,000 miles away somehow interact with each other. So that's what we're trying to put together now, and I've actually got pretty far on that. And of course, working on better and new pattern recognitions, which is the research that I'm going to be continuing forward. So that's the engineering. And then finally, the science. Looking at different aspects of emotion and what happens and how repeatable this is. Back actually with Miguel very early on when I was first here, and continuing through Javier, looking at different ways of measuring emotion repeatedly, both, well, let me give you a couple examples. The first is a piece that we did in Casa Paganini all those years ago, or not a piece, but actually a research protocol, where we had violinists performing a piece in neutral state, expressing specific emotion and being induced with a specific emotion, and seeing what the differences are between those. Because if I'm performing, and one of the questions I get asked with stem cells is, so what are you doing? Are you pretending? Are you emoting, or are you feeling? And of course, it doesn't work unless I'm feeling. And matter of fact, I think one of the hardest things I ever did here, well, first, one hard thing is to repeat that piece more than once in a short period of time. It's like, oh, practice again. Yeah, practice going through these emotions is an extremely difficult thing. But actually, one of the hardest things that we did at SARC was Nick Gillian, another graduate student, and I wanted to see how repeatable going from intense sadness to happiness was, and where those boundaries were, what that surface was like. And so I did do imagery to take myself into that space, and that was horrific. I mean, it was just absolutely, because your body, produces this intense amount of cortisol when you get into that state, and then you start to flush it out as you move to the happy state. But it just becomes a very intense and difficult experience. But these are some of the. But this is actually the emotional induction was done prior to this, and then what we do is we look at the various changes in physiology that occur over that, and try to find relationships between the change in physiology, the change in music, and what's going on there under these different kind of states. And how am I doing? 15 minutes. Okay. So we had three pieces, what we consider to be a neutral piece, a sad piece, and a happy piece. And we worked with two induced emotions, happiness and sadness. And the reason why I mentioned about this difficult thing that I did here with Nick is because it first lit itself up when we did this experiment. We actually can never do this experiment again, at least not here, because not with the individual involved, because the induction of sadness was so hard on the people we were inducing sadness with, and actually the person that was doing the sadness induction, the psychology student that was doing the sadness instruction, that she never wanted to do it again. But we had some very, very interesting data from this, and I've talked to Roddy about how we could repeat this experiment again and make, using sadness as one of the states, and possibly how we can get around some of these issues for everybody involved. What we measured was muscle tension, skin sweat, and heart rate. We had looked at accelerometry just to see their movement in the performance, pressure sensor, video cameras, and obviously the audio. We had 43 performances looking at 13 different streams of data for a total of 559 streams of data. And I'm just going to show you one of the results that I really, really found fascinating from these experiments, was that this is the change in heart rate when you have expressed happiness and induced happiness, and you'll notice roughly the same amount. And then look at the difference between expressed sadness and induced sadness, the enormous amount of difference. in heart rate variability between the trying to express, oh, I'm sad, I'm going to play like this, and actually being sad. And actually, if you looked at the performers when they played sad, they didn't play like this. They played normally, but with intense sadness inside them. The really interesting experiment that we have going now, we tripped on. We tripped upon. We didn't intend to ever create an experiment like this, but the Science Gallery in Dublin was looking for an installation, and we sort of sat around saying, what can we do for an installation at the Science Gallery in Dublin? And we brainstormed on this for a while and came up with this idea of having a bunch of people come up to a music terminal and sit down and listen to some music with sensors on their fingertips, because of course we've got to get the physiological indicators of motion, and answering some questions about what they heard. And maybe we'll get to build a database of how emotion, your emotions, everybody's emotions as a listener, and music relate to each other, so that we can then get to that question I asked early on about calibration. How can we figure out what is this range of skin sweat, what is this range of heart rate that exists within people during different kinds of music, and then we can incorporate that science into the art. And so we did this study, and we were looking at self-report measures, physiological and the property of the music. And then I've got Niall's. See, I'm trying to get everybody's stuff in here somewhere. I've got Niall's video here, basically showing what they currently wear on the installation. The incredible Max patch from Miguel. Some random individual. And this is what they have to do at the beginning of each experiment, and they get to see their pulse ox as they set up the experiment. And what's interesting about this is that we did this at the Science Gallery in Dublin, and then Miguel was dragged into doing this in Genoa in a closet downstairs for a day in the bottom of Casa Paganini. 3 days, I'm sorry. It was 3 days. And what emotion did you feel during that? And then we actually took it to the World Science Fair in New York City, and then it's now in Bergen. I don't know how much data we're getting off of Bergen. We're getting some data off of Bergen, okay, good. But we've run it in a whole bunch of places, and how many song listens are we up to right now?
Probably over 15,000.
Over 15,000 song listens, over 5,000 people. So now when we talk about calibration, the science is beginning to inform the art. We're beginning to see all of these people. We now have this incredible collection of what are the range of GSR values, and we even, Javier just recently noticed that things like skin dryness versus wetness and what the effect of that is, obviously how well they put on the sensors, things like that. But we're getting this enormous database to inform, because I want audiences of several hundred people with their mobile phones wearing this thing. Well, we need to know what that looks like and how they will react, and this is going to begin to inform that, as well as begin to inform how do people's emotion, when you hear a song, how does your emotion change over the course of that song? And so we get some quite interesting results. There are a total of 54 songs. First of all, we did some demographics on those. What songs do you listen to? Of course, yes, rock, woof, 67.8%. Thank you very much. It was a number so small that we couldn't type in the times 10 to the minus whatever in there. Some of the demographics, just so you can see the age distribution. And no, it doesn't happen that there were huge baby booms in these years. It just happens that some people didn't fill out the last digit of their birthday the way we had set up the max batch. So those are 1950, 60, 70, and 80. There weren't baby booms on the decades. But what you can see here is that the majority of people were born in the 1980s, which for me is incredibly depressing. I thought this was interesting. I always throw this slide up because how people rate their musical expertise from novice to expert. I never thought you'd get that kind of distribution. I actually thought it would be more bimodal, but now people sort of say, okay. So there you go. You take that home. Top rated songs for most enjoyed. and the top 3 rated songs for most engaging. Smells like Teen Spirit, yeah. We were horrifically accused of having way too much prog rock and music from the 1970s. I apologize. Niall, the other graduate student, just produced this a couple weeks ago, and I told him I will use this slide early and often. It's a fantastic distribution of the emotional ranking. Remember at the beginning of the talk I gave you dimensions of emotion, and I said there's the Russell circumflex between happy and sad, maximum activation, minimum activation. And so you can now see how some of the songs that we have in there show up in that distribution. There's Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, high activation, semi-positive, which is interesting too, because remember, emotion is complicated. So when you hear Smells Like Teen Spirit, do you think of the pounding change in the song? Do you think of the fact that he died? Do you think of, and you get kind of sad, which is actually what always happens when I think of listen to Nirvana? Or do you think of, what was the guy's name, the comedian that did that version of Smells Like Teen Spirit? Weird Al. You think of Weird Al Yankovic's version of that thing and start giggling. So emotions are really, really complicated. But it ends up with looking at this many people and averaging over that much. It puts it right where you think it is. Beach Boys, a very, very good vibrations, very, very positive song. So things are ending up exactly where you would think they would. Bing Crosby, White Christmas, slightly pop. This is where serenity lies, not just because of Bing Crosby, but on this graph. Because here's a positive emotion, minimum arousal. So that's serenity, and that's what happens with me when I listen to Bing Crosby, White Christmas. Maybe not. Probably half the people in this room don't even know. Who in here doesn't know Bing Crosby, White Christmas? Okay, it's not as bad as what I thought, but there are at least 3 or 4 people that have never heard it before, which is perfectly depressing. And this is what Javier is working on right now, which is now not just looking at these emotional states and how people are feeling from the point of view of the whole song and where they exist, but also the changes that occur within the song. What happens over the course of this song in terms of here's the audio, here's what's happening, this is a particular song, what's happening to the heart rate variability, the heart rate change, or the skin sweat during the course of that song? Is there meaning in the different edges, different points within the song? Can we see these wonderful transitions as there are wonderful transitions in the song itself? So the continuity, the dimensional change, the exploring of the surface of that song with your internal surfaces of emotions and how those tie together. Are those surfaces one with each other? Do you move in and out? Because remember at the beginning I said, it's not just each one of you that's giving me, represents an emotion that I'm feeling and that when you watch me, but you're moving back and forth within your internal and your memories and moving in and out. So what happens in there? How does that affect what's going on in there? So that's some of the things that Javier is working on right now to put things together. So where do we go from here? The arts. For me, as I mentioned too at the beginning, it's about shared emotion, and shared emotion is about empathy. One of the things I quote, a really sad thing that I quote, from 2011 was that University of Michigan does a study every year on empathy. They have a standard psychological test for empathy. And they've been running it for about 30 years now. And over the course of the 30 years, they've never had as low a score amongst teenagers of 15 to 20 as they have right now, ever. To me, that's one of the things with the internet. On the internet, nobody feels empathy. You're separated, you're distanced, you don't feel and touch when you're communicating. But then you say, well, wait a second, I see these pictures, and I communicate through these pictures and these images that I would never see before, and can I touch? And the answer is yeah, of course. Of course you see all these things, but it's the dynamism that empathy is gauging. Empathy is a dialogue between you and me. And that dialogue is gauged by you nodding, you making physical gestures. Skype annoys the crap out of me because, yeah, you're there, but I'm missing all of the subtleties of your gesture. Everything that happens that makes me understand whether you empathize with what do you hear what I'm saying? Do you appreciate it? Do you feel that? And am I feeling the right thing? Because sometimes I've reacted completely wrongly to something somebody says, I giggle a little, and then you see that facial reaction pop back at you as you realize, no, that wasn't meant to be funny. And so to me, that exploring those spaces is the interesting aspect. Can we do that in the art of creating music? The boring part, the engineering, nobody likes these sensors at all. They break, you trip over them, they're terrible. I love a Knapp. We have Knapps everywhere in all the research that I do. Knapp is fantastic. It's this off-body sensor how do we do this stuff on body that makes, that we can reveal the invisible things inside us without tethering us down and making us uncomfortable. And then finally, how do we map those surfaces that I began talking about at the beginning? Where are they? What do they look like? How do I map them? So that's kind of where we're headed now. And here, I think I haven't said Gassia's name. Hi, Gassia. Gassia is incredible because in this transition between science and art, you need somebody that's incredibly good at the art, and it's really wonderful to work with Gassia because of that. And so these are the other people that I have shouted out. I think I didn't mention Brennan. Brennan's in the United States, but he's the one working on the mobile platform and emotion on mobile platforms. I, as they say here, hoovered him out of sorry, from the bottom of the United States. And I just wanted to, on my flight over, my aunt's died, and so I just wanted to, I hadn't had a chance to think about her, so I feel like they're down for me to take a moment. Thanks. This is where I am now. So this is why you're here, which is the discussion now.
Just a bit confused when you measure, when you say you're measuring the, because let's see if I understand. You measure transpiration, heartbeat, things like that. So in terms of synesthesia, how do you distinguish, for instance, happiness synesthesia or kinesthesia from anxiety, which is also produces transpiration and more faster heartbeat, something like that? And then you define it as happiness, and how do you distinguish as anxiety or something like this?
Well, distinguishing them is not, it's a really good question in terms of how do you distinguish things with common physiology. And there's two areas where you can go with that. One is the direction of a lot of the physiology does discriminate, but not perfectly. And the other area that I go is what I mentioned at the beginning, which is that if I do that, scroll up to there. What you're saying is, what if that looks like that? What if it's inseparable? What if these peaks in here that I classify as joy or anger, what if they look at the aliens, they look similar? And what I would say is that A, I'm not sure whether they do or not, we have to explore that, but B, I'm interested in this movement more than I am in classifying that that's joy on there. So this is the typical psychology approach, is to look here and say that's joy, and that's this, and that's that. But in music, and in composing for this, it's less interesting for me, this is just my own bias, than to just be able to say, I'm somewhere, and now I'm going to move here, and what does that look like, and what does that feel like? And I'm going to move here. And we're going to explore that in the relationship of music, and we're going to see how everyone moves across these spaces and surfaces. And we're not going to label this as a particular point. We're just going to say everybody's in this area and now we're moving, or everybody's not, in this area, now everybody's moving here, and what do these, and that's really was insinuated a lot by working on the stem cells piece, where, you know, things naturally happened. There's a part of the piece that is entirely driven forward by my transition of emotion. And if you asked me to label what my emotion was going in, what my emotion was, I couldn't even come up with my own label. But moving through that is easy and delicate for me. It's very straightforward as to how I do that. So the answer is I don't know how to separate those, and there's a definite science question there, and people are looking at that, but I'm not, because I'm interested more in the motion between. Yeah.
Why do you choose to use the word emotion? Because what you're actually doing is looking for time correlations between state changes in music and state changes in measurements. Is that right?
No, I mean, yes, in that, so the latter is yes, but is not exclusive of the former. We're looking at, you're speaking about the emotion-emotion experiment. There we are looking at time correlations in physiology and how that relates to time correlations in music. The measurement of those is with the autonomic nervous system, which is predominantly a function of emotional state. Obviously there can be, as I said, there can be contextual changes based on things, but if I see your GSR change and move, your skin sweat change and move, I know that there's a reaction within your autonomic nervous system, which is a reaction in relation to emotion. Now, the emotion change could be a function of cognition. In other words, you could have a cognitive, I'm thinking about how we need to go outside there, and you guys are probably getting bored out of your minds. Okay, so I'm thinking that, and then I'm worried, so I go from cognition to emotion, that emotion then changes this. So physiological indicators of emotion are not exclusive to emotion. ANS is not exclusive to emotion, but it's predominated by the emotional change. So that's why in that experiment, we're saying looking to emotion. But we're validating that by saying, is there correlates between your self-report? So we don't ask you necessarily about your cognitive state. We're saying, what did you feel in that song?
Yeah.
Did you, what emotionally? And we actually say, how did that song make you feel?
So I'm not questioning the correlation with the autonomic nervous system. It's more how that is then recorded, because that's a set of assumptions.
How does it?
Well, I mean, the clearest assumption was in the thing where you put up the experimental bar and said, what was it? We're going to assume that the canon is neutral and the adagio is sad and the partita is happy, for example, which is not a particular. I mean, it's to use your own critical language. That's like a sort of Skype level
Absolutely.
association.
That language was there because what we didn't, the construction of those pieces, or choice of those pieces, was simply to not create something that was such a barrier to the emotion itself. So if we induced sadness and we had you play a song that was happy, it'd be such an affront to what was going on that we decided we wouldn't do that. So we basically chose a selection of songs as relatively benign. Yeah, I mean, these are really vague words, and 100% agree with that. Relatively sad and relatively happy, to be able to see, can we watch to see this induction go through this piece, and we didn't want to have the interference of the play of the song itself. But absolutely, I mean, you know, and again, those are antithetical to my entire thesis, which is I hate labeling. So never in the purpose of that or in any of this work is it the purpose to say that piece is happy, that piece is sad, this is this is that. But more in that sense, it was just to create, if you will, a screen door by which things can pass through without being interfered with.
My worry is that what appears to be the top level of what you're doing is this kind of emotional labeling, and what's important about it is the kind of empathy correlation, which isn't really the same thing.
No, I mean, but I don't think the emotional labeling is the top. It's the emotional labeling is what we're trying to stay away from. But those peaks.
Joy, anger.
Yeah, and that was the point. Is the point here is exactly that. That this labeling is in fact what one half of psychology looks at, and it's in fact the dimensionality down here which is the interesting part. This is just the surface, this is what's happening underneath, and it's that, well, as we just talked about, it's that movement between the two that's the really intriguing part, not the labeling. But to validate some of this stuff, it's interesting. For example, the circumplex that I showed at the end, where we had people self-report versus what we actually thought the songs were and where they ended up in dimensionality from the label. It was nice to see that it was actually an amount of agreement there. We also discovered, I didn't mention, which is that plot was normalized. What we actually found is all songs were biased positive. So even the most negative songs were biased positive in there. We normalized everything else down. I will, of course, normalized everything down and overlaid it on the circumplex. But that's interesting too, to see how music inherently, no matter how angry and nasty it is, biases positive. Yeah.
You talked about showing the data of the body signals in the performance, and could you share us your experience of how much you showed and what was the feedback from the audience, and all this balance of what you show and what you don't show in the performance?
I'll begin by saying I wish I had a good answer to that, but I don't. I have feedback from it, which is that some people have been really interested in it. Oh, I watched your heart rate go up right here, and then you saw your GSI coming down. And I was like, eh. So they were really positive about it, and I was thinking, I didn't want you to do that. And then, of course, there was the horrible thing that happened when we were in Australia, which was that the display of the heart rate, was an octave low. So instead of having my heart rate normally is between 50 and 100. Well, actually, in performance, it goes to about 120, 130 at the most tense times. And it was an octave below, so it was like 25 at one point. And so there was giggling, and people were looking at this thing and saying, "Oh my God, he's got a heart rate. Oh, this is hilarious." Which is not the thing you want to do. So I'm such mixed ideas. One of the pieces that Eric Gossi and I are working on is this trio piece, and it's a chamber music piece. And every time we perform that piece, I purposefully wear a suit coat and hide all the sensors and have nothing displayed, because I think all of us don't really want any of the tech to interfere with that. So I don't have a good answer to that. I really don't know where. I know if you're doing a TED Talk, you're definitely going to have the signals up there. But I don't know in between. Have you ever done a performance where you showed the signals live?
No.
So see there.
I show the wires.
You show the wires, yeah, which is cool. I mean, it's sort of part of the aesthetic of it, to see the wires and see the bands.
If you don't show the data, how do people know what emotion they share? Should there be empathy, or if you want empathy?
I do want empathy, but the question is, in the piece, is the byproduct of empathy, if we composed it right, wouldn't it just be aural? Could we somehow hear that, and would people know? And we did a debrief in New York one time. Garcia improvised a violin solo with audience measurement, and Eric had programmed it so that if the audience was relaxed, it would be more of a cathedral-like level of reverb, and when the audience was excited, it was more tight and dry. And then there was also harmonization as well. So when the audience was relaxed, there was a harmonization, and when the audience was excited, there was not. And we performed that piece 4 times and did an informal, we didn't have a questionnaire, we did an informal debrief afterwards. Twice the feedback was, that was good. Okay, I don't really know what was going on. Yeah, whatever. And then 2 times it was the dead opposite. This was an incredibly emotional experience. I've never felt anything. I don't know exactly what was happening and how it was working, but I felt this connection with Garcia and the performer, and it was just amazing, the interaction with it. And I don't know. I don't know what was there and why twice we had this incredible connection between performer and audience, and twice, not so much. I don't know what was there. But that to me are the interesting conversations and challenges with this arena that I wish a lot more people were involved in, because it really is an interesting conversation.
Because you are there as a performer, no? At the stage, sitting or standing or whatever, and you show your presence. And I have a bit of difficulties with Alvin Lucier's piece, for example, because he sits on the stage and close his eyes, and sometimes I get what activates what sound, but I also have all this question about you present yourself and how much you reveal in terms of performance, gesture and data and all this balance.
Yeah.
Okay.
And of course the age-old question of instrument design, which is how clear do you want the action and the result to be?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's tough because a lot, again, a very old conversation, but instruments that you have a mental model for, even though the first time seeing you might not have seen cause and effect, because you have the mental model, you infer that makes sound. This is an instrument. You don't. I've never shown you this before. How do you know? Well, you've got a model of how that works. Sometimes I want to do our pieces several times just so that the audience can begin to get a mental model of it. Because the first time through, there's no context for what's going on, and that creates the problem as well. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks very much, Ben. I just wanted to pick up a different sort of issue than so far, which is really the way you treat the audience as a collective, which is often to speak of it as if it was like a person, as if it was in some way unified. And this is where the science, I hope at some point, because I know you've now got a big team and so on happening, you can bring in some anthropology, sociology. I tell you why. It's because the findings would, from that side of the social sciences, would ask us to be interested in cultural differences and social differences as they cross any audience. And the findings are that not so much of unity, but of very different experiences. And I think to be interested in that would and to use, say, the demographic data you're collecting, which is fantastic, would really take you to another step, because so there's that, which is, it seems we hear differently. And the emotions we have, that's the problem with saying this is likely to induce happiness, or this is, for many kids today, listening to that partito would just turn them off completely, So we need to be interested in those differences, it seems to me. But on the other hand, your concern with contagion, we talked about this when we sat talking. Contagion is an issue that's been picked up in light of this old French sociologist, Gabriel Tarde, and then the crowd theorists from the 1920s, all of whom were convinced, I think like you're convinced, that whatever the differences in an audience, things can move through them. And I also think that's very exciting and interesting. But I just think that to ask the second question about contagion of affect without first being concerned with the differences that are really there and exist, also in the deepest way that our subjectivity is tuned into sounds and musical worlds. I just think you can't do the one without the other.
I absolutely agree, and I found this picture, this graph here, because to me, when I first saw it, it was like, that's an audience, because in essence, each one of those is different, and that in both directions, each audience member is different. So their view of me and what they're feeling and what they're probing and how they're moving through their surfaces is each unique. With its own context, its own memories, everything associated with it. And then my view, my relationship to so here's a lumpy surface, and everybody looking at me has their own lumpy surface that they're looking through that context of. I couldn't agree more strongly, and certainly the research that we do with older people, you know, it always, when I go to conferences on technology for older people and everybody talks about older people, I think always two things. One is there isn't any one older person, and B, I'm one of them. And I'm complicated, so, you know, there's no older people. And yes, the audiences are heterogeneous here, and they're heterogeneous in place, because in place represents place and demographic, and you get these beautiful differences. And what would that look like? And I'm excited because that means, I think, it would mean that every time we performed this piece, it would be ever so slightly different because the audiences would be ever so slightly different. And again, I guess it gets a little bit back to Simon's comment. The language, I have trouble even in making it complex enough, because when I say the audience is different, then yes, of course, the overall, but then there's the individuals as you probe in, and which is why I use Prezi a lot in my presentations, because it's all about zooming in, and every time you zoom in, it's like a fractal, and you just keep seeing the detail, and it's almost magnification invariant, meaning that every single time you see the same level of complexity, you think, I'm going to zoom in one more time, and the complexity will be gone. But it never leaves, you know, the heterogeneity never leaves. I go into the individual, and then I go into their experience, and I go, and it gets equally as complex, zooming in.